Hello, everyone. Welcome to Merrill Auditorium. It is Monday night, March 14th. We are 8 days away from the Bach Birthday Bash being presented by the Friends of the Kotzschmar organ. I am Shireen Chahawi. I am the former executive director of the Friends of the Kotzschmar organ, but a forever friend of the Kotzschmar organ. So I am here tonight with my pal and your favorite municipal organist, James Kennerly. He's going to tell us a little bit about what's coming up a week from tomorrow night on, remember, March 22nd at 7:30 here at Merrill. Tickets are available at portix.com. So make sure that you get your seats reserved, or your tickets reserved. You're not reserving a seat, but get your ticket reserved and join us. But let's bring James out. You don't want to see me. So James Kennerly, Portland's municipal organist.
Thanks, Shireen, and welcome everyone. It's great to be here back in Merrill preparing for a live concert with actual real live people in the audience, and that's something that we're still sort of getting over, the excitement and thrill of being able to do that after really a 2-year hiatus. And so there's really no better way to do that than with this organ and the king of organ composers, Johann Sebastian Bach. And this year he would have been 337, I think. And so that's quite a good going for somebody's music to feel so fresh and so vital, so exciting, be so very old. So we're going to have some questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And I know we've had a lot of people contact us by email in advance, so we're going to have a few that you've already sent in.
We're sideways.
Oh, we're sideways.
Yeah, that's not good. There we go. But this means we have to do this. I'm sorry, everyone. There we go.
That looks cool.
I think you're okay.
Awesome. So, maybe I'll start with the first piece on the program. If you want to go to our website, FOCO, FOKO.org, you'll be able to find the full program and listings and everything. But the first piece I'm playing is a little bit like an overture to a concert. It's a celebratory piece and very bright in G major, which is a nice happy key. And it's an unusual titled piece. It's called the Pièce d'Orgue, which a pièce in French means a piece, or in a house it means a room. D'orgue means of the organ. So this implies that it has some French affinities, although of course Bach was very much German. And this is how it begins. It's got this wonderful, what we would call a toccata. That's the Italian word that really means just to touch the keys. You're barely pushing them down. And it comes from the very much the keyboard tradition, perhaps from North Germany, perhaps from Italy, not necessarily from France. But that's the first section. At the end of that section, we have this wonderful kind of swirling line. And then we have a very distinctive part. So this is the middle section. It's marked with the French term gravement. Grave means slow, grand, and that, of course, wasn't necessarily a title that Bach put in. We've talked about this before in our Bach concerts, that many of his pieces don't come to us with his holograph, his autograph, where he actually wrote these names and notes. So this may have come, I forget exactly, from a pupil, maybe from one of his children. And of course, it might be a copy of a copy of a copy, and people added these titles over the years. But it's a very different sound from that first bright Italianate toccata, and it's in 5 parts. That means there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different voices played by the feet and the fingers. Here's what happens in the bass, in the feet. And then here's the next lowest part. And then here's the next one. And then there's another one. And then the very top one. And if you combine all 5 of them together, that's what creates this beautiful sort of taut harmony, which we might say is perhaps French, these suspensions where notes are sort of carried over the measure line, and it becomes very expressive. Here they are all together. Wonderful. Now, the magic of the Facebook Live and of our, modern day recording is extraordinary, but you will not get the effect of the organ sound. And of course, Shireen is here and I'm here on stage, and we can feel that sound as well as hear it, especially in the bass. It's just a very grand, wonderful, visceral sound, and that is what makes the organ so special, and especially hearing the organ live. Now, the third part of this piece, because it's in 3, is quite different again. Have a listen. So what we have there is we call a chromatic line. Chroma is the Greek word for color, and that means that instead of playing the sort of the main notes of the keyboard, we play all of the in-between notes. And that makes the music really expressive. So in my feet, I have a chromatic line. And on top of that, I have this fantastic, again, a very sort of keyboardy, toccatory figuration. And when I combine those two together, which you could never do on any other instrument but the organ, because of course I can't play one note down here, another note's up here, another note's up here. But I have my feet so I can play the bass notes, I have my hands to play the keyboard notes. It's a really thrilling piece, and it ends with a big, bold sweep on the organ up to the big, strong final chord, bringing us back to the home key of G major. So that's the Pièce d'Orgue, the Fantasia, it was also called, in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach. That opens our 2022 Bach Birthday Bash. Incidentally, it's in the same key that Happy Birthday is most often sung to. No coincidence, I'm sure.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question, James.
Great.
This is from Justin, who's on Facebook Live with us, and this is an easy one. How does that console turn on and off?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Justin. Justin asks how this console, so that's what we call the flight deck, this massive piece of machinery here, how does it turn on and off? And you'll see there are lots of buttons here, lots of bells and whistles. Literally, here's a bell. I'm not going to be using those for the music of Bach, but there's no on switch on this console. I can turn the lights on and off, but I can't turn the power on. To do that, I have to go backstage behind the pipes. You can just see some of them up there. And backstage there is a big sort of control box that I push the green button, and of course it all lights up. And then you push the red button and it all starts sort of winding down. So that's how we turn this massive console, and of course the organ and the wind turbines, the blowers that create all of the air for the pipes. That all comes on with one button.
Okay, so Justin had a second question, but I think we can put it up with another one,
cool.
Which is, what is your favorite Bach piece? Which I know you won't answer, but someone else asked, what would you pick to play for Bach if he were alive today and was going to listen to you? Which of his pieces would you play?
Wow. Well, the first question, my favorite Bach piece, it's really the one that I'm playing at a particular time, because his music is so extraordinary, and of course it's not just the organ music, there's the keyboard music more generally for the clavichord or the harpsichord, and there are the cantatas for voices, there are the concertos for instruments. There's so much music by Bach that is just wonderful. So generally it's the piece that I'm playing at the time. Probably at the moment it's the Prelude and Fugue in E minor that I'm going to play at the end of this concert, because it's just a wonderful, rich and exciting piece. But if Bach were here, now the problem with Bach and his music is that we have a lot of questions that the notation doesn't answer. And I explained with the first piece I'm playing, the Fantasia in G, well, we don't have Bach's written autograph, so we don't know exactly what he meant. Was it this note or that note? How fast should it go? What kind of stops should we pull on? Should we play it more sort of flamboyantly, more reverently? All of those kinds of questions that I would love to ask him and say, Herr Bach, what should I do here? But I think if Bach were here now, I would ask him, did you write the Toccata and Fugue in D minor? Now that's the famous one that you all know. It's probably the most famous piece of organ music, certainly the most famous piece of organ music, and maybe one of the most famous pieces of all-time music. And there has been a debate, really, for the last 250 years, since Bach has died, on who wrote it, because we don't have his autograph, we don't have the written testimony that Bach wrote this. We have a much later source, and from the 19th century, I think, maybe the late 18th, that gives us the piece. So I would love to know if Bach wrote that, or if he wrote it for a different instrument, maybe the violin, or he wrote it for a different occasion and it was assembled, or I don't know. But I would love to know the answer to that question.
Ruth from Cape Cod would like to know, what's the hardest piece to play by Bach and why?
Oh boy, the hardest piece to play by Bach. So there are two things to bear in mind with any kind of music, really. One is the technical part. That's how quickly you can play your fingers or your feet. If you're a violinist or a string player, it's how quickly you can move your hands for the bow and your fingers on the strings. If you're a wind player, you play the oboe or the flute, it's how quickly you can, sort of breathe and produce the articulation with your mouth or the notes with your fingers. So that's the technical part of being difficult. But then there's the musical part of being difficult, what we call the interpretation. Because Bach, as I said before, gave us a lot of information, the notes to play, how long to hold them, which sharps or flats we should play, sometimes, very occasionally, the stops, the sounds we should use. But after that, he kind of leaves us to our own devices. And a certain amount of that information would have probably been second nature in Bach's day, and it's been lost over the centuries. So sometimes pieces are really hard to play because you're not quite sure what the articulation should be, what the speed should be, the tempo. And so, again, that varies depending on the music that we're playing or the organ that we're playing it on. And I'm thinking one of the hardest things might be how to produce the articulation. I'm going to think of one of the pieces I'm playing at the end. Now that's the fugue, the opening of the fugue in E minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, if you listen very carefully, I played those notes all separate. Because Bach wrote them separately. He didn't join them together with what we call a slur, that's a line that goes over the notes. And he didn't put staccato on them, but we know from contemporary writing that the standard way of playing notes in Bach's day was slightly detached. The French term is détaché. Now, if I played it legato, listen to the difference. first one. The second one. So that first one, I think, has a lot of energy. Tum, ta, ta, ta. You can really hear the articulation. So I think that that gives the piece the energy that it implies, and it really sort of builds the work up in terms of its character. But I don't know that that's how it should sound, and it might well be that, the concert is in a week's time. I come back and it's different in a week's time after I've thought about it. So it's that kind of thing that makes the interpretation of Bach's music a great thrill, and some would say a challenge, but I think, and the classic response would be an opportunity. There's no one way of playing it correctly, and there are infinite ways of playing it differently. And so I love the fact that Bach's music takes all of those different interpretations, whether it might be the Moog synthesizer, or an organist on a big concert organ like this, or perhaps a much smaller mechanical action organ, and everything in between.
I'm going to combine a question.
Cool.
So Henry from New York was wondering, how do you select a program from Bach's compositions? Like, how do you decide?
Yeah.
And I know you and I were talking about styles that you're going to be playing next week. Can you speak to how do you make a decision that jigsaw puzzle it together for an event?
Yeah. So how do I put together a program of Bach's organ music? It's a real challenge, and it normally begins with what I call my wish list, which used to be, I use an iPhone, so I use the Apple Notes, and if I'm, walking around somewhere and I have an idea, I open up my notes and I put it into the wish list. And this wish list, of course, grows to hundreds of items because Bach wrote so many wonderful pieces for the organ, and not just selecting the ones I like, but of course the ones that contrast nicely or compare nicely with the others. And so over the course of the year, I suppose, the last 6 months, I've been thinking about pieces I really wanted to do. So one of them was that fugue, that prelude and fugue in E minor that closes out the concert. I've never played it in a concert before. I really wanted to do that. So I said, right, I'm going to play that piece. Now, that piece is a big, grand work. It was called by one of Bach's biographers, Philip Spitter, who wrote a biography in 1873. He called it a two-movement symphony with a life force. So it has this character about it that is orchestral, almost like an opera by Wagner or a symphony by Berlioz or Beethoven. It takes on this extraordinary character. And so I really wanted to do that piece because it is such a strong character. It's going to be at the end of the program, otherwise it would steal all the thunder. So that's how I started the end. And I thought, well, I have to begin with something that will complement that. So I thought, well, how about that Fantasia, the pièce d'orgue in G major? So that creates the bookends, beginning and end. And it sounds mundane, but because we are still sort of coming back from COVID, we are doing a single half, as it were, well, it's not a half, it's a whole. But instead of doing our usual sort of two halves with an intermission, we're actually making things a little more condensed so that people spend less time inside. So this is going to be a beginning and an end all in one half without an intermission. And so it's just a case of filling in the blanks. So we know from Bach's organ recitals that he would do the big pieces at either end and then smaller pieces in between to show off the different colors, the different sounds of the organ that he was playing on, that he was showing off, demonstrating. So I've sort of taken that lead and I've put some smaller pieces as well as some bigger pieces in the middle of those two. And that's really how I came to the program that we have, which I hope is going to be a balanced program of the loud and fast versus soft and quiet, etc.
Frank from Falmouth is curious, what would people be most surprised to hear about Bach's life?
Well, great question. I'm going to answer that in a sad way and then in a slightly more musical way. The sad way is that Bach had 2 wives and 20 children. But sadly, of course, not all at once. Only 10 of his children survived into adulthood. And of course, his first wife died, most tragically when he was on a trip. So Bach returned to find that his wife had died. I mean, it was just an unimaginable sorrow that he must have felt. And you really we have to be careful of reading too much of the autobiography of somebody's life into their music, because they didn't think like we did now. We don't know if they wrote their story, their life story, into their music. But we can certainly relate to the fact that Bach had feelings very similar to the way that we have feelings. He would have expressed deep, deep sorrow at the passing of those children and of his first wife. And all of that comes through in the beauty, the lyricism, the tragedy, the sadness, if you want, the sorrow of Bach's music. But I think also in the joy, because he experienced an awful lot of joy with the birth of those children and with the extraordinary music that he was able to produce and that they were able to perform. So there's this bittersweet element of Bach's life that I think is surprising to many. And the other one is that one of the most famous pieces, I'm going to play it now, here we go, that was composed by Johann Sebastian Bach, was for the keyboard, and it was from a collection called the Well-Tempered Klavier. Das Wohltempiert Klavier, the well-tuned, you might say, keyboard. That means the keyboard, which could mean a harpsichord, a piano, a clavichord, an organ. The way of tuning it, so getting every single note, how it relates to every other single note, it's very complicated, and I will not bore you all with that now. But suffice to say, in the 18th century, there were lots of discussions about how you should tune your keyboard. And Bach wrote these pieces, 24, in every single minor key. That's C major, and then C minor, and C sharp major, and C sharp minor, and D major, and D minor, E flat major, E flat minor. You get the picture. And for every one of those major and minor keys, he wrote a prelude and a fugue. The first is in C major, and it sounds like this. You probably all know that piece. But I bet you won't know, well, you probably will know this one. So that is perhaps one of the most famous melodies. And a little bit like the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney, this was a collaboration because the melody was written by a French 19th century composer called Charles Gounod. He was really most famous for his operatic compositions. And in the 1850s, he was sitting, playing that prelude by Bach, and he improvised this melody on top of it. And his father-in-law apparently wrote it down, notated it, and then it was later published as a piece called Meditation for orchestra with a violin solo playing that lovely melody. And then a little bit later, in 1859, a new version was published with the words Ave Maria added, and that's the one you probably know best. Ave Maria, gratia plena, etc. And if you've ever been to a wedding or something like that, you've almost certainly heard that piece. But it wasn't written by Gounod, and it wasn't written by Bach. The accompaniment, as it were, was written by Bach, and the melody by Gounod. So you might say, until Lennon and McCartney, it was one of the great collaborations in music history. And I'm playing that piece because our board president recommended it. He actually said to me, oh, do you know this piece that is based on the C major prelude by Bach? And I thought, I have a little gap in my program. I'm going to add that in. He's sitting right here, and he probably doesn't even know that's how I chose him. But that's how these things happen. So you asked how I program pieces. Sometimes it's things I want to do because I've been thinking. Sometimes it's brilliant suggestions from our audience members or from our board of directors who say, hey, how about this piece? Or why don't you think about that? So we're always, musicians, we're like sponges. We're always picking up ideas. But you will hear that in a new transcription that I made, especially for this wonderful organ, to show off those colors. These colors are called the strings. beautiful shimmering sound you would not expect to hear in a traditional performance of a Bach organ concert, because they're just not the sounds that Bach had. You don't need to use them for his music, but of course in this orchestral 19th century version we can suddenly bring out all of the colors, and that's really what this organ does best, that orchestral sound. So you're going to hear that for the first time in a week's time.
Well, speaking of transcriptions, Maggie from Houston wants to know which instrumentations are best suited to organ transcriptions from Bach's compositions.
Great question. Which instruments are most suited to transcribe for the organ from Bach's pieces? Now, Bach wrote for strings. He wrote for wind instruments like oboes and bassoons. He wrote for trumpets. He wrote for timpani. That's hard to transcribe for the organ because we don't have any timpani. But a few years ago, you might remember a piece I played, which was the Symphonia to Cantata 29, which is a very celebratory piece. And it features these trumpets. And of course the full orchestra, and also an organ solo. And so all of those instruments can be transcribed for the organ. I think the best are the wind instruments. And there's one piece that I'm playing, again, a new transcription that I made just for this concert. And you've almost certainly heard it before. It sounds like this. So that's a piece called Sheep May Safely Graze. And originally it was written for a soprano, a female singer, who would have sung up here. And we don't have any voice stops on the organ. Well, technically we do. We have these ones called the human voice, the vox humana. It sounds like an old lady singing rather than a beautiful youthful soprano. So I've chosen this sound, which is actually, it's called the contrafagotto, the bassoon, really. And I chose it because it cuts through the rest of the sound. Bach scored the piece for recorders, which he called Flauti dolci, sweet, soft flutes. In German, they were called Blockflöte, so block flutes. In French, flûte à bec, wooden flutes, but they sound very soft. And have a listen. Now, why did Bach use those instruments? Well, this piece is not a religious piece. Sheep May Safely Graze is not about sort of Jesus the Good Shepherd. This is talking about a leader. It's actually referencing classical antiquity. Think about Greece, Diana, who's the goddess of the hunt. And the Baroque composers especially love to go back to the Greek times and suggest that their times were just as idyllic and pastoral. So he sets for us a scene, a pastoral scene, like we're out in the mountains and the fields, perhaps. And he does that in a couple of ways. By using those wind instruments, we think of Pan, who played his pan pipes. Well, that's sort of what we're emulating here. And the harmonies are very simple and relaxed. We combine those two. So this piece was actually a birthday present for Bach's boss, who was a hunter, and it's a cantata about hunting, and essentially he uses this Greek mythology and applies it to to this neighbor, the buddy of Bach's boss in Weimar, to say, oh, you're a wonderful man, and you know how nature works, and you're harmonious, and you're such a good leader. Turns out he wasn't a very good leader. He was a spendthrift and almost bankrupted the estate. But that's how you pleased your bosses in the 18th century. But it shows how the transcription for organ works beautifully, because we have sounds that sound like a recorder. There's beautiful soft flutes. We have a sound that's not really a human voice, but it works nicely, it blends nicely. So that's a nice example of how the instruments transcribe. And another one is another transcription, known commonly as Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. This is a piece from a cantata, and it's a religious piece in this case. And what Bach does is he takes the hymn, the chorale, and he hides it. Bach is the master of disguise. He hides things so beautifully that they just appear like a flower blooming. Have a listen to how that melody, that chorale, appears from the orchestral version, which is written for strings and also an oboe. Excuse me, I'm going to check my registrations. There we go. Clever, and again transcribes beautifully because the voices, I can use that sound, and then again for the strings and the flute and the oboe, I can use that. So again, transcribes very nicely for the organ from the orchestra.
You have a young fan in Falmouth named Thea who realizes that today is Pi Day.
Oh yes.
And can you share any musical themes that might speak to the Mighty 3.14 in either Bach's compositions or other composers?
Great question. So today is Pi Day. Happy Pi Day, everybody. 3.1427, I forget. I used to be able to do it to like 20 decimal places. And then I had a baby. Not literally my wife. No. But I will say that Bach loved numbers. He loved science. He loved mathematics. And in the Renaissance, that was the period just before the Baroque period when Bach lived, there was a way of educating people called the liberal arts. There are 7 of them. And the quadrivium, that's the part with 4, has things like geometry, arithmetic, astrology. And the 4th one, music. So music was considered a science, a mathematical way of understanding the world. And when you couldn't measure it with a tape measure or with a theorem, you could account for it by the way that music sort of lined up with the stars in the heavens. Essentially, these people were trying to work out how they got here, why we exist, where we're going, and music answered a lot of those questions. So music was very important and has often been connected with science and with mathematics. Bach was invested into a society called the Mitzler Society when he was working in Leipzig, the final part of his life, in the big university town, still very important institution today with the university and the St. Thomas Church, the Thomaskirche. And when he was inducted into the society, he had a wonderful portrait painted by Haussmann. I'm going to show it to you here. Here is Bach. This is the Haussmann portrait. And if you look closely, he's holding some music. Now, I do not expect you to transcribe or see what it says, but it says canon triplex. That means it's a canon. It's not a cannon that you fire, it's a canon that you play. But it means that you have a musical line that if you started at different times, it builds into a more fuller piece. I can do this with a very simple canon. Here is one just with a scale, and it starts here. And here is a very simple one. I could sort of do it in different ways. So that's a very crude canon. Bach's canons, of course, are anything but crude. They are extraordinarily mathematical, and to work them out, you have to have a very mathematically oriented brain. But Bach was absolutely, I think it's fair to say, obsessed with numerology, with numbers. And many of his pieces, including, in fact, the Prelude and Fugue in E minor I'm playing at the end of the program, have very significant numerological traits. So that means that if you add up the measure numbers, you get special signifying totals. For example, the golden section, the golden mean, which, again, from Greek classical antiquity all the way through to the present day, and of course observed originally in nature, the idea of what is a sort of a perfect ratio, and that's present in many of Bach's pieces. Now, what we don't know is whether he sat there with a pen and pencil and worked out the proportions, or if he was just divinely inspired, and the music that he wrote just flowed from his quill, and that's because he was perfect, the music was perfect, the inspiration was perfect. That's how we get the music that we have. We're never going to know that, but we do know that he loved science, he loved mathematics, and I think there are a few too many coincidences in his music to argue away the fact that there's this numerological significance. So there's no pi reference per se. There might be, maybe we just haven't found it yet, but definitely references to numbers, very, very complicated and wonderful ones.
This is just a quick, and I put it into the chat within the thing. But someone said, please remind people about the wonderful tour video that you have on YouTube and on our Facebook.
Yes, yeah, go to our YouTube page, FOCO YouTube page, and you can do a virtual tour of this wonderful organ that we recorded a few years ago. Little did we know that COVID would stop us doing our in-person tours. But I will say, if you haven't been inside this amazing instrument yet, then you have not lived, quite literally, because it's amazing. You see these pipes, some of them you see in the screen there. They are what we call facade pipes. They are for show. They're kind of like clothes. They hide all of the mechanism, the thousands of pipes and wind chests and air conveyances and bellows and pressurizers and wires and magnets and all of the cool stuff that make this organ speak. It's just the coolest thing in the world. So if you don't get a chance to watch the video, which you all should, then you must, when we resume our in-person tours, come and do a tour of the organ. You can find out all about that on our website, foco.org.
You and I talked a little bit about, do you want to talk about the registrations for this particular concert?
That's a great question. Registrations, now what does that mean? Well, I have all of these white things left and right of me. They're called stops. I have about 170 on this organ. And then I have these 5 keyboards. And then I have the pedals with my feet, which you can maybe just see. And if not, you can see them on one of our many videos. And Bach does not tell us what stops to use. So he does not tell us how to register his music. Now, luckily, we know how he probably registered his music because he used a very, very common combination of stops. And I'm going to show you what that sounds like. The basic sound for Bach was called the principal, the diapason. They're classic organ pipes, just like the ones you see in the facade behind you, and they sound like this. Now, if I pull out one that's, I think we've talked about this before, but they have different numbers on them. And the numbers talk about the length of the lowest pipe. The lowest pipe on that sound, that stop, is 8 feet long. And on the organ, and any sound, if you cut the string or the pipe in half, it's going to sound an octave higher. So here's one that's 4 foot long, it's going to sound an octave up. Here's the 4. Here's one that is 2, it's going to sound an octave higher again. had 8, 4, and 2. I'm going to combine the 3 of them together. 8, 4, and 2. And immediately we get that lovely sparkly organ sound. But wait, there's more. There are sounds called mixtures, which are a combination of different pitches of pipes, generally high-pitched pipes, that all speak at the same time. So that probably has, or maybe, all sounding at once. If I add the mixture together with the other ones, you see it's even brighter and sparklier. 8, 4, 2, mixture. Done. So that is how Bach registered, set up the sounds for his loud organ pieces. Here's one, for example, the Toccata in C major. Etc. Now I did something naughty there. I went down to another keyboard. Bach doesn't tell me to do that. He just says play it on this keyboard. In fact, often in his music, he doesn't tell you to use the feet. He writes it on 2 staves just like a piano. And we know because, well, we sort of work out there are too many notes to play with the hands that he must have meant it to be used with the feet. But he doesn't specifically say in many cases. But this piece is unusual because there is a pedal solo. Echo. Etc. So Bach gives us some hints at what you might do, but he doesn't tell us explicitly. So we register based on the best sounds, I think, of the organ. And this organ has a lot of wonderful, rich sounds that I will use in some pieces. And the purists will criticize that no end, because it's not what Bach would have done, because we know what stops he would have used. But I think it makes this organ and the music sound the best. So especially a couple of pieces, the big fugues, the D minor fugue, the Dorian fugue, and the final one, the Wedge fugue in E minor. They use some of the biggest sounds like a crescendo, because it's like a symphony orchestra. And at the very end of the Wedge fugue, I pull on the biggest sound of all, the 32-foot reed, which just sounds like a rattle to you and I, but when I add it in with the full organ, have a listen to how thrilling it sounds. Let's see. So again, I did some what we call soloing out. I played a line on what we call the tuba stop. Again, Bach would never have done that. He didn't have anything like that. He just wouldn't have done that. But I think it brings the very best of this instrument out in the music. And incidentally, when you listen to that piece, its nickname, which it acquired in the 19th century, Bach's pieces all got nicknames, just like Beethoven's sonatas, the Moonlight Sonata, the Appassionata. He didn't give them those names. We did. And likewise, Bach's pieces got nicknames from organists and music lovers. This one was called the Wedge. Have a listen, see if you can find out why. So this is the fugue that's called the subject, and the subject gets wider. It goes down and it goes up at the same time, a little bit like a wedge. And if you listen to it, sorry, wider. So it's getting wider, and that was nicknamed the Wedge fugue. It makes for a very exciting piece, and that's the one I talked about with all of the registrations, and that's the one that his biographer talked about as being full of life and like a two-movement symphony almost. So I'm going to treat it like an orchestral symphony as well.
So we have just one more question,
Cool.
and then we'll let you stop. And this might be a hard one too, but Paula from Boston wants to know, what do you think J.S. Bach's favorite piece was of his own?
What was Bach's favorite piece? Well, we have some idea what Bach's favorite pieces were because he published. So when a composer published in the 18th century, that they had to invest a lot of time, a lot of money, and a fair amount of risk in having the music engraved. That means that it was put on a copper plate, and somebody who's very specialized had to make a sort of a mirror image version that they would carve out, and then you would use that to print onto the paper. That all took a lot of time and money, and you only published something if it was really, really, really worth it and you loved it. And Bach did publish. He published 4 volumes of pieces called the Klavierübung, the keyboard practice. And you probably know probably the most famous of them is the 4th book. That includes a piece that begins like this. Variations. Bach didn't call them the Goldberg variations, somebody else did. But that was the 4th part. Then the 3rd part was a book of organ music, which you heard a couple of years ago here. It starts with a beautiful prelude. Etc. So he clearly loved that piece and the pieces that go with it. And the first book has a piece in B minor called the French Overture. And then in F major called the Italian Concerto. So we can pretty much surmise that he really loved those pieces. Which of them were his favorite? It's hard to tell. He also wrote a piece called the Art of Fugue, which uses a melody that it's put in various permutations brilliantly and slightly wackily because it's a very heavily mental exercise to work all of that out. And also a piece called the Musical Offering, which was a gift to, again, another patron he was trying to get some money from and some recognition. So he probably valued all of those pieces most, but we, of course, will never know because he didn't, sadly, keep a diary.
Well, I think that covers all the questions.
Awesome.
So my apologies to everyone. When we flipped to portrait, we lost our correct. We're seeing everything in reverse, James, on Facebook, but I will go in and flip that, and we'll post the right one on YouTube. But I'll just let you close it out for people.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here. Please, 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 please come to the concert. It's on Tuesday, March 22nd. That's the day after Bach's birthday. Don't let anyone tell you he was born on March 31. He was born on March 21. And in 1700, they changed the calendar from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, and some people thought, oh, we should recalculate his birthday. No. He was born on March 21, so this will be the day after his 337 and 1th celebration of his birth, and you're going to hear the most amazing music on what I think is one of the most amazing pipe organs. So do join us then. You can also visit the website to watch the digital version as well. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Shireen.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.